Hi, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. Today, I'm going to explore how the Interpretivist epistemological lens helps me better understand and address my problem of practice, one that is both practical and deeply tied to values, relationships, and social justice. As a reminder, epistemology refers to how we come to know what we know, our assumptions about truth, knowledge, and meaning. It shapes how we frame problems, what kinds of solutions we pursue, and how we engage with the people around us in organizational life. I've chosen interpretivism as the paradigm that I believe most accurately reflects the complexities and human-centered nature of my problem of practice. In this presentation, I'll briefly define interpretivism and its key features, particularly drawing on the work of Capper and Burrell and Morgan. I'll also explain how this lens aligns with my specific POP, why I selected interpretivism over other epistemologies, and how it has influenced my evolving views on policy development and governance in my school context. I'll close by reflecting on the potential for interpretivism to foster more equitable, inclusive, and meaningful leadership practices, especially in the realm of advancement and fundraising. To ground this presentation, I'll briefly revisit my problem of practice. My focus is on fundraising in independent schools, more specifically on how we can reimagine advancement strategies to be more equitable, culturally responsive, and mission-aligned in the current philanthropic landscape. This issue is particularly pressing given the complex intersection of financial pressure, political volatility, and growing demands for equity and inclusion in Canadian education. Independent schools often rely heavily on philanthropy to support scholarships, infrastructure, and long-term sustainability. Yet, traditional fundraising models tend to reinforce established power structures. Wealth is often concentrated in predominantly white, cisgender, upper-class donor communities, while many equity-deserving alumni and families remain underengaged or even alienated from the advancement process. We are at a critical moment where philanthropic practices must evolve. It's no longer just about how much money we raise, it's about how and from whom we raise it, and whether our advancement culture reflects the values we claim to uphold. These questions are not merely operational, they are epistemological and ethical. They invite us to reconsider how we define success, how we understand relationships, and whose voices matter in institutional decision-making. Through this lens, fundraising becomes not just a technical function, but a cultural and relational practice, one that must be understood in its social context. That's why I believe interpretivism offers a powerful tool for rethinking advancement work in schools like mine. So what exactly is interpretivism, and why is it relevant here? Interpretivist epistemology is rooted in the belief that reality is socially constructed. In other words, knowledge is not discovered through objective observation alone, it is created through human interaction, language, culture, and experience. What we know is shaped by who we are, where we stand, and how we make meaning of our world in relationship with others. Capper offers a helpful summary of interpretivism, positioning it within Burrell and Morgan's framework as both subjective, focused on individual perception, and regulatory, seeking to understand rather than disrupt. Interpretivism values context, dialogue, empathy, and the co-construction of understanding. In an organizational setting, this means focusing less on universal solutions and more on how different people experience the same structure in different ways. In schools, this lens allows us to examine how students, staff, families, alumni, and donors understand the culture and practices of this institution, and how their perceptions shape their engagement and trust. It's also important to note that Capper adds a critical caution here. She argues that while interpretivism can be valuable, it does not automatically center equity. For example, she critiques the human resources and symbolic frames of leadership as sometimes reinforcing privilege under the guise of culture or fit. Phrases like, "that's just how we do things here," can mask deeply entrenched inequities. So while interpretivism opens space for understanding experience, leaders must be intentional about whose experiences are being centered and to what end. That said, there are other scholars, particularly in philanthropic studies, who highlight interpretivism's potential to support equity by emphasizing relational accountability, lived experience, and community voice. These are foundational to rethinking fundraising in more inclusive and socially just ways. Let me now explain more specifically why interpretivism is the most appropriate lens for my problem of practice. Fundraising at its core is not just about dollars raised, it's about relationships, trust, values, identity, and story. The more I engage with literature on trust-based philanthropy and affective giving, the clearer it becomes that advancement work is deeply emotional, personal, and context-driven. Donors are not simply financial contributors, they are individuals whose willingness to give is shaped by their experiences, values, beliefs, and perceptions of institutional alignment. An interpretivist lens makes space for that complexity. Rather than treating donors as data points or fundraising targets, it encourages advancement professionals to engage in meaning making, to ask, how do different communities understand giving? What motivates their involvement? What historical or social experiences shape their willingness or hesitation to support an institution like ours? This lens is particularly powerful when considering the experiences of equity-deserving alumni and families, communities who may feel alienated by traditional philanthropic culture. Interpretivism invites school leaders to listen carefully, to engage in dialogue, and to acknowledge that different groups may attach different meanings to fundraising, wealth, giving, and belonging. For example, alumni from underrepresented communities might view their time at the school as one of survival rather than belonging, and may not identify with nostalgic narratives often used in donor appeals. If we ignore this subjectivity, we risk deepening exclusion. But if we engage with it interpretively, through conversation, storytelling, and shared reflection, we can begin to reshape fundraising as an inclusive, human-centered practice. Interpretivism helps us move from how do we raise more money to how can we co-create a giving culture that reflects our shared values and supports institutional justice. That brings me to the question of why I chose interpretivism over other paradigms. In developing my milestone paper, I did explore a critical interpretivist blend because I strongly believe the power, history, and systemic inequity must be accounted for in leadership work. I remain committed to this hybrid stance, but for the purposes of this presentation and to deepen my understanding of interpretivism on its own, I chose to focus solely on that lens. I also explored other paradigms, including feminist theory, critical theory, Black crit, disability studies, and queer theory, especially because these frameworks often foreground equity, power, and resistance. Many of the sources I engage with, such as studies on 2S LGBTQ+ alumni giving, are grounded in those traditions and have shaped my thinking significantly. However, I found that these critical paradigms, while deeply important, tend to approach fundraising through a lens of critique and structural analysis. They often emphasize what is wrong, what is oppressive, and what needs dismantling, which is valuable, but can feel detached from the relational and cultural work of actual fundraising practice in schools. These paradigms also sometimes assume a level of detachment from institutional leadership, focusing more on activism than co-creation within governance structures. Interpretivism, by contrast, offers a lens that is deeply embedded in practice. It acknowledges power, but also makes room for possibility. It allows us to focus on the day-to-day meaning-making between donors, staff, alumni, and leaders. It helps us understand why some people feel connected to giving and others feel excluded, not just as a political fact, but as a lived emotional experience. So while I value critical approaches and continue to be informed by them, interpretivism gives me a pragmatic and compassionate framework for engaging with fundraising in ways that honor subjectivity, context, and relationship building. Earlier in this course, I shared a metaphor for effective policy. It should have strong teeth and gums, meaning it must establish clear boundaries, be well communicated, and have consistent follow-through. While I still believe those characteristics are essential, my understanding of good policy has evolved through the interpretivist lens. Interpretivism invites us to see policy not just as a compliance tool, but as a relational and cultural artifact. That is, policies carry meaning. They signal whose voices are valued, what norms are upheld, and how justice is interpreted within a school community. Policies built through interpretivist processes are grounded in the lived experiences of those they affect. This means involving diverse stakeholders in the creation, revision, and evaluation of policies, not just for consultation, but for co-creation. It also means attending to how policies are interpreted and enacted differently by various members of the school community. For example, a gift acceptance policy might look neutral on paper, but could inadvertently discourage gifts from non-traditional donors or equity-deserving communities if it includes language or requirements that feel exclusionary or out of touch. An interpretivist approach would encourage leaders to engage in dialogue with these communities, explore their experiences with giving, and revise the policy collaboratively to reflect shared values. If I had applied this lens earlier, I might have begun my introduction to policy earlier on in the course, not with structure and clarity, but with equity and participation. Interpretivism has shown me that policy work is not just about technical writing. It's about storytelling, relationship building, and co-constructing meaning in ways that honor diverse perspectives and experiences. Interpretivism has also reshaped how I view governance structures within my school. As I mentioned in my introductory video, my school is governed by a board of directors rather than a traditional school board. Our accrediting organization mandates an arm's length approach to governance, which means board members are expected to stay out of operational matters. This makes sense in principle. It protects school leadership from micromanagement and allows the head of school and senior team to lead. However, through an interpretivist lens, I now see that arm's length does not have to mean disengaged. While the board may not be involved in daily decisions, it plays a powerful role in setting the tone, modeling values, and shaping the broader culture of the institution. Board members are not just fiduciaries, they are meaning makers. Interpretivism suggests that governance should be dialogic, responsive, and rooted in shared meaning. Rather than issuing mandates or passively reviewing reports, boards should actively engage in conversations with school leadership, faculty, families, and students, listening deeply to understand how institutional policies and practices are being interpreted and experienced. An example of this approach appears in the Governance Core 2.0 on page 165, where a public school board articulates its core values around cultural responsiveness, collaborative decision-making, and equity-focused dialogue. Although my school operates in a different structure, the spirit of this approach aligns with interpretivist governance. Decisions emerge through relationship, not just hierarchy. Applying this to advancement, I now believe the board should be more involved in equity decisions around fundraising, not in an operational sense, but as stewards of culture. They should be asking, how are our fundraising practices perceived? Who feels invited in and who feels left out? How do our values show up in our donor strategy? This shift would not only support inclusion, it would strengthen trust and transparency across the whole school community. In closing, I want to return to the heart of why interpretivism matters, not just for this presentation, but for my own leadership journey. Interpretivism challenges us to see institutions through new eyes. It reminds us that schools are not just buildings or policies, they are communities of meaning. Every policy, every fundraising appeal, every interaction with a family or alum carries emotional and cultural weight. These experiences shape how people understand, trust, and invest in the institution. Capper cautions us not to confuse charity with justice. Interpretivism, when applied thoughtfully, can help us keep that distinction clear. It doesn't automatically guarantee equity, but it creates the conditions for equity work to take root. It requires us to listen, to reflect, and to lead with humility and empathy. For me, this has transformed the way I think about advancement. By changing how we understand fundraising, by shifting from transactional to relational, from extractive to co-creative, we can change what fundraising becomes. It can be a force not just for revenue, but for connection, accountability, and shared purpose. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening. Here are the references I used for this presentation, and I look forward to hearing your feedback.